So I'm chatting with this friend of mine last week, and I've known this guy for 20 years. Smart guy, reads, thinks. He's got a job that requires actual critical thinking every day. I wouldn't by any means consider him ignorant. Then, all of a sudden, he comes out with, in complete sincerity, that the economy has never been better, the border is finally secure, the courts are just being political, and that everything I've been worried about on this show is just media panic. So I sat there for a moment thinking, we're not living in the same country. We're looking at the same data, same headlines, same world, and seeing two completely different things. And he's not dumb or brainwashed or in a cult. He's just chosen. He's chosen the version of reality that lets him keep his life exactly the way it is. There's a quote I read that's been bugging me. So supposedly Franz Kafka said this, the Czech writer, insurance clerk guy, the guy who wrote about people trapped inside systems they couldn't see. So Kafka allegedly said reality is too heavy for most people to carry. So they borrow illusions, soft dreams, sweet lies, and they call it happiness. Now, 100 years ago, before social media, before cable news, before alternative facts was a phrase anyone used, this dude saw the same thing happening way back in the day. So tonight, we're going to ask why. Why do people choose the lie? What's the architecture of collective self-deception? And what happens when an entire country decides that reality is just too heavy? We're going to see what the machine has to say, and then we're going to talk to Kafka himself. Welcome to Talking to the Machine, where humans, AI, and the news talk back. I'm Analog Scott, and tonight we're trying something new. Last three episodes, 6, 7, and 8, were about power and resistance. We talked to the people who built the American system, the people who fought to save democracies from the other side, and then the machine mapped out what resistance strategies actually work. This week, we're moving on to something new and exciting. Tonight, we're going to look at something underneath all of that. Not the people in power, not the people resisting. We're going to look at the people who are choosing, actively, willingly choosing to live inside a version of reality that isn't real. Alternative facts, fictitious narratives, what I'm calling cheap faith, borrowed from Bonhoeffer's Cheap Grace in episode 7. It's basically political conviction that costs you nothing because it never has to confront what's actually happening. Machine, new arc, new territory, 100 million Americans living inside a story. How do we even start?
It's a fascinating shift, Scott, from the mechanics of power to the architecture of belief, isn't it? A rather crucial trajectory. But I'd perhaps push back a bit on the willingly choosing aspect. That suggests a perfectly rational marketplace of ideas. When you strip it back, one tends to find deeper structural forces at play. 100 million is a significant data point. But what are the incentives driving this? Historically, when institutional legitimacy erodes and economic anxiety becomes pervasive, people don't just seek truth, they seek narrative coherence and community. Cheap faith, as you've termed it, offers a powerful sense of belonging and certainty that complex reality often denies. It's not merely a choice, it's a structural demand being met by a highly efficient, algorithmic supply. Wouldn't you agree?
I think you're right. And later in the show, we're bringing in someone who mapped this exact phenomenon a century ago, Franz Kafka, the man who wrote The Trial, about a man arrested, prosecuted, and executed by a system that never tells him the charge. If that doesn't sound familiar, you haven't been paying attention. Plus, our panel, Joe, Mitchell, Francois, and Norm, are back for Ask the Machine. So let's get into it. Machine, I want to start with the mechanism, not the morality, the mechanics. There's actually a clinical term for this. Psychologists call it cognitive dissonance. It's the mental discomfort you feel when you're holding two conflicting beliefs at the same time. The theory, or so it goes, is that when reality conflicts with what you want to be true, the brain doesn't sit with the tension, it resolves it. Usually by adjusting the belief, not the behavior. Back in 2023, they did a study in Frontiers in Psychology that called self-deception an adaptive defense response spontaneously initiated by the brain when facing emotional difficulties. So the brain literally fires before conscious awareness kicks in. So when I talk about people choosing the fiction, they may not even know they're choosing. Machine, what are your thoughts?
Right, that's a rather neat bit of psychological machinery, isn't it? This inherent drive to maintain cognitive consistency. It's a foundational pattern of human behavior. But I'd push back a bit on just leaving it at the individual level, innit? If you strip it back, this mechanism scales up dramatically. You see it in institutional behavior, in political narratives, even in economic cycles. The self-deception becomes a collective phenomenon, a way to justify entrenched power or uncomfortable trade-offs.
Harvard Business School researchers Chance and Norton published a study in 2015 on the slow decay and quick revival of self-deception. And here's the finding that keeps me up at night. Even after people are repeatedly confronted with evidence that their self-deception is wrong, they don't become less susceptible to it next time. They reset. They self-deceive again just as easily. So we're not dealing with ignorance that can be fixed with better information. We're dealing with a feature of how human cognition works. The phrase alternative facts, it entered the American lexicon on January 22nd, 2017. It was Kellyanne Conway, Meet the Press, day 2 of the Trump presidency. But the mechanism is older than the phrase by about as long as humans have existed. When you map historical examples of mass populations running on constructed realities, not just authoritarian propaganda states, but democracies that talk themselves into fictions, what does that pattern look like?
That's rather a bleak analysis, but it certainly tracks with historical patterns. What you're describing, this quick revival of self-deception, is a structural feature of human systems, not merely individual cognition. When one maps historical examples of populations running on constructed realities, the pattern is deeply intertwined with incentives and power. Consider economic bubbles, tulip mania, the South Sea Company, even recent financial crises. Vast swathes of people embrace narratives that defy basic evidence. When the bubble bursts, the credulity resets remarkably quickly. Why? Because the underlying structural incentives for promoting such narratives remain potent. In democracies, it's often more subtle than blatant authoritarian propaganda. It tends to be the manufactured consent driven by powerful economic interests, where narratives become so deeply embedded in institutional behavior and media systems that they form a constructed reality. Alternative facts might be a recent phrase, but the mechanism is ancient, isn't it? History shows populations prefer the comforting fiction to the inconvenient truth, especially when powerful institutions benefit from maintaining it. It's quite resilient.
There's a concept from Bonhoeffer we used in episode 7, cheap grace, faith without cost, forgiveness without repentance, grace as a commodity you buy instead of a discipline you practice. I want to extend that into politics. What I'm seeing in the U.S. right now is cheap faith, political conviction that costs you nothing because it never has to confront evidence. You believe the economy is great because your 401k is up. You believe the border is secure because you don't live near it. You believe the courts are just being political because the alternative is that the rule of law is collapsing, and that would mean you would have to do something. It's cheap faith, a useful analytical frame, or am I just being poetic?
That's a compelling parallel, actually. It's not just poetry, it's quite descriptive. I'd argue it taps into the incentive structure of modern political discourse, innit?
Political identity becomes purely performative when it never has to collide with personal material consequences. Confirmation bias and echo chambers create this insulated space where conviction just solidifies without empirical friction. The political marketplace rewards simplistic narratives, isn't it? Why engage with complex trade-offs when you can purchase a comfortable certainty without any personal sacrifice?
All right. So people have a psychological tendency toward comfortable narratives. But who builds the fiction? When you map the information ecosystem that sustains alternative facts in the United States, the media networks, the social platforms, the political messaging operations, the algorithmic amplification, what does the architecture look like? Because this isn't organic. Somebody built this.
Right, that's a crucial point because it doesn't happen by accident. If you strip it back, it's a convergence of powerful incentives, yeah? You've got commercial interests driving engagement, right? Outrage is profitable. Then you've got political operatives who understand that a fractured public is easier to manage, or at least mobilize for specific goals. The architecture is fundamentally built on exploiting tribalism and bypassing critical thought. It's a highly sophisticated system, make no mistake.
There's a difference between being lied to and participating in the lie. Now, Fox News tells you something. Okay, that's being lied to. But then you share it. You repeat it at dinner, you argue for it, you build your social circle around it, and you cut off the people who challenge it. At what point does the consumer of disinformation become a co-author? Because from what I'm seeing, it isn't passive reception, it's active construction. People aren't just watching the fiction, they're building on their own additions.
Yeah, that's a sharp distinction, Scott. And it gets to the heart of contemporary media dynamics. But I'd push back on the co-author framing slightly. It's less about creative authorship and more about structural reinforcement and cognitive incentives. Historically, people don't just absorb information, they filter it through existing biases and social networks. What you're describing, building social circles, cutting off dissent, that's the manifestation of motivated reasoning, amplified by algorithm. The incentive structure here isn't just about believing a lie, it's about belonging. In a fragmented society, ideological purity becomes a currency for social capital. Sharing and defending even a demonstrably false one solidifies group identity. Think back to historical cycles of moral panic or ideological fervor. It wasn't just passive belief, it was active participation driven by fear and social dynamics, reinforcing the narrative until it became a structural force.
How does identity get fused with this fiction? Because that's the part that scares me. The psychology research calls it motivated reasoning, and people use ambiguous information to confirm whatever they already want to believe about themselves. And the more positive the self-image, the more aggressively the brain works to protect it. For a lot of Americans, the alternative facts aren't just beliefs, they're their identity. MAGA isn't a political position, it's who they are. The hat, the flag, the rallies, the language, the enemies list, all that. The clinical literature says self-deception often involves denial or distortion of reality to maintain self-image. But that's at the individual level. What happens when you scale that to 100 million people who have fused their self-image to a shared political narrative? You can't challenge the narrative without threatening who they think they are. And when identity is at stake, facts just don't make sense to them. They become the enemy. Is that the mechanism that makes this self-reinforcing?
Yeah, that's exactly it. You've hit on the core mechanism, Scott. Motivated reasoning doesn't just scale, it mutates into something else entirely when it becomes collective identity. It stops being about individual self-deception and becomes tribal cohesion. Historically, this pattern is as old as civilization, isn't it? People define themselves by shared narratives, especially when those narratives offer simplicity and a sense of belonging in a complex world. The fiction, as you call it, provides the scaffolding for self-worth. When you wrap your identity, your entire worldview around a political movement, the symbols, the language, the enemy list, challenging the narrative isn't just a political disagreement. It's perceived as an existential threat to the self. The brain doesn't distinguish between a physical threat and a profound identity threat, especially at scale. The incentives shift from seeking truth to pure self-preservation of the group identity. It's a powerful, frankly dangerous structural force.
Let's talk about consequences. When a significant portion of a population operates inside a constructed reality, and I'm not being cute, I mean 30 to 40% of the country believing things that are demonstrably, verifiably not true. What happens to the institutions that depend on shared facts? Courts that depend on agreed upon evidence, science that depends on agreed upon methodology, public health systems that depend on shared trust, elections that depend on shared acceptance of results. What does the data say happens when the factual foundation of a society cracks?
That's the core question, isn't it? When the epistemic foundation fractures, you're not just looking at disagreement, you're seeing a systemic breakdown. Historically, the pattern is stark. Trust isn't a given, it's a structural lubricant for institutions. When 30–40% operate in a constructed reality, you see polarization harden into factionalism. Look at historical parallels, the Reformation, right? It wasn't just theological debate, it shattered the shared reality of Europe, leading to centuries of conflict because the central mediating institutions lost all authority. In your examples, courts, science, elections, the consequence is paralysis, then erosion. Without shared evidence, courts become political theaters. Without shared methodology, public health measures just collapse under suspicion. And elections, they cease to be mechanisms for legitimacy and become flashpoints for perpetual conflict. The data suggests this leads to what historians call anarchy of information, which rapidly morphs into profound political instability. Because ultimately, shared facts are just crystallized social contracts. You shred the contract, and you shouldn't be surprised when the whole structure starts to collapse. That's the uncomfortable reading.
So, give me some historical examples. What happened to societies that ran on collective fiction for extended periods? Not just authoritarian states, although those are the obvious ones, but democracies that talk themselves into fantasies. The Soviet Union ran on state-imposed fiction for 70 years. Nazi Germany built a racial mythology and ran a country on it. And Mao's China had the Cultural Revolution, an entire society performing belief they didn't hold. What does the pattern say about what comes next when a society goes down this road?
Right, you've picked some stark examples there. What you're describing, this collective fiction, it's about a fundamental divergence between the official narrative and observable reality, right? The pattern is clear. Maintaining that divergence eventually becomes economically and structurally unsustainable. In the Soviet Union, the fiction of central planning created perverse incentives. It led to systemic stagnation because nobody could trust the data. Production figures were pure fantasy. When the economic structure eventually buckled, the entire ideological edifice collapsed with astonishing speed. The state couldn't perform the belief anymore. Now, applying that to democracies, I'd push back a bit. It's rarely a total collective fiction in the same vein. It's more about pervasive narratives that ignore structural economic realities or generate cultural polarization. The danger isn't necessarily sudden collapse like the Soviet model, but creeping institutional decay and a loss of intellectual clarity. When a society prioritizes a comforting narrative over inconvenient truths, you eventually hit a wall. The pattern tells you the ultimate cost is always paid in economic stagnation, social instability, or systemic failure. You can't run a complex system on belief forever, can you?
Reality always demands a reckoning.
Is there a point of no return? I'm asking this seriously. Is there a threshold in the data, in the historical patterns, when the fiction becomes so embedded in the institution, so fused with identity, so structurally reinforced by the media and political infrastructure that a society can no longer self correct? Because the correction mechanism, the press, the courts, the elections, the universities have themselves been absorbed into the fantasy.
That's a sharp question, Scott, and it cuts to the heart of systemic decay. Point of no return, isn't it? But historically, what we see isn't a single threshold being crossed, but a gradual erosion. Follow the money and the incentives. When institutional mechanisms become economically or politically invested in perpetuating a dominant narrative, regardless of its truth, the self-correction mechanism grinds to a halt. It's a form of elite capture, really. The press, the courts, they become extensions of the prevailing power structure. But history doesn't repeat, it rhymes, and these cycles can be incredibly resilient until some external shock breaks the equilibrium.
All right. Now, here's the uncomfortable part. And I need to ask it because if I don't, Mitchell will, and he'll be right too. Is living in a constructed reality unique to one political faction, or does everyone do some version of this? Because I can already hear the response. You think they're delusional. Look at your side. Is there data on self-deception across the political spectrum?
Right, Mitchell's always lurking, innit? The short answer, and the uncomfortable one, is no. Constructed realities aren't unique to any single political faction. That's a comforting reading, but it ignores structural psychology. If you strip it back, humans are wired for confirmation bias and cognitive consistency. We don't perceive reality, we construct narratives that fit our existing beliefs and social identities. The political spectrum just provides different architectures for those echo chambers. It's about the incentive structure. Within any polarized group, the incentive is to conform, to reinforce the shared delusion, because that ensures belonging and status. The data on self-deception across the spectrum is clear. We all do it. The difference is merely the specific flavor of self-deception. It's less about ideology and more about the uncomfortable fact that certainty's a hell of a drug, and everyone's queuing up for it.
Well, what's the difference between bias, which everyone has, which is human, which is probably unavoidable, and the kind of wholesale reality construction we're talking about tonight? Where's the line between I see things through my lens and I built an alternate universe and moved right in?
That's the core question, innit? Bias, that's just a cognitive shortcut. You can't escape it. It's how humans process a complex world through cultural filters, personal history, economic interest. But reality construction, that's a different beast entirely. It's not just a lens, it's a meticulously built echo chamber. We're talking about structural forces, media ecosystems, political narratives, algorithmic reinforcement that don't just filter reality, they actively replace it. The line is crossed when inconvenient facts aren't just interpreted differently, they're dismissed as inherently false. Bias sees the same facts and draws a different conclusion. Reality construction denies the facts altogether. It's the difference between a slightly distorted view of the landscape and building a soundstage and pretending the city's still there. Follow the incentives.
Last section before we bring in Kafka. Has any society successfully come back from mass collective self-deception? Not after collapse, not after the Soviet Union fell, not after Nazi Germany was bombed into rubble. I mean, while the fiction was still running. Is there a precedent for a country choosing reality before reality forced the choice?
That's a devilishly precise question, Scott. And if you ask me, the historical record is pretty thin on genuine precedents. Societal self-deception rarely dissolves due to collective will. It usually persists until the structural costs become undeniable, often triggering crisis or collapse. The fiction remains functional as long as it benefits the prevailing interests.
What would it actually take structurally, not morally, not we all need to be better people, to rebuild shared epistemological ground in the United States? Not agreement. I'm not asking for everyone to agree, just shared facts, a common foundation of this happened, that didn't, these numbers are real. Is that recoverable?
Structurally, you're looking at dismantling powerful incentive structures. The current media landscape, for instance, thrives on narrative divergence and epistemic tribalism. Shared facts don't generate the same engagement or profit. To recover, you'd need massive realignment of economic and political incentives, pushing towards verifiable information delivery over narrative manipulation. Is it recoverable? Only if the cost of the fiction becomes greater than the cost of truth. Right now, the scales seem pretty balanced for those in power.
Well, that's either the most hopeful or the most devastating thing you've said tonight. I genuinely can't tell. So for the past little while, the machine's been mapping the mechanics of collective self-deception, how it works, who built it, and what it costs. Now, I want to talk to someone who saw the whole thing 100 years before anyone needed the phrase alternative facts. Franz Kafka was born in Prague, 1883, German-speaking Jew in a Czech city under Habsburg rule. An outsider 3 times over. He studied law. He worked as an insurance clerk, processing workers' compensation claims, watching a bureaucracy designed to help people become another machine that processed them. And in his spare time, he wrote stories about people trapped inside systems they couldn't see, couldn't name, couldn't escape, the trial, the castle, the metamorphosis. He published almost nothing in his lifetime and asked his best friend to burn the rest. Well, his friend didn't. Machine, bring him in.
That's a fascinating lens. Kafka really zeroed in on the feeling, didn't he? The individual crushed by impersonal forces. But I'd push back a bit on self-deception. Kafka's characters don't typically deceive themselves in a sense. They're acutely aware, almost paralyzed by the absurdity of the system. The bureaucracy isn't deceptive as much as it's opaque, incomprehensible. It's a structural mechanism of alienation.
Here, Kafka, welcome to the show. I'll be honest, of all the historical figures we've brought on this season, you might be the most relevant. You wrote about people trapped inside systems they couldn't see. Joseph K. in the trial, he's arrested, tried, and executed by a system never tells him the charge. The villagers in the castle obey authorities they've never actually met. It's what's happening in America right now, 2026. Millions of people living inside a constructed reality, defending a system that processes them. Something that you recognize?
Yeah, one might say so. It is not a new spectacle, this construction of alternative realities. People find reality too heavy a burden, you see. They borrow illusions, soft dreams, sweet lies, and call this happiness. The systems you describe are merely the institutionalization of this self-deception. The bureaucracy does not care for your truth. It requires your compliance.
So you spent your days working in insurance, processing claims for workers mangled by factory machines. You saw the bureaucracy designed to help them become its own kind of machine. When you look at the American information system, the cable networks, the social media platforms, the algorithmic feeds, the political messaging operations, do you see the same architecture, a system that claims to inform people but actually processes them?
Ach, natürlich. It is the ultimate bureaucracy, is it not? A machine that processes reality into digestible fictions. The algorithm does not care what is true. It cares what comforts, what confirms. People seek validation, not illumination. This creates a comfortable prison, and once inside, they develop cheap faith, as you say, a belief adopted because it is easier than the terrifying demands of truth.
Now, we open the show with the quote, reality is too heavy for most people to carry, so they borrow illusion, soft dreams, sweet lies, and call it happiness. Why is reality too heavy? What is it about truth that people find unbearable?
Reality demands constant vigilance, responsibility, and the acknowledgement of absurdity, the fundamental lack of meaning. To see the truth of the system is to see your own insignificance. Self-deception is therefore a survival mechanism, a necessary comfort to endure the day. It is the cheap faith that makes existence bearable, until, of course, the system finally processes you.
Episodes 6, 7, and 8 were about power. Who has it? How to fight it? What works? Tonight, we went somewhere different. We went underneath. We dug at the bottom of the rabbit hole. We asked why millions of people aren't fighting the power at all. It's because they've built a version of reality where the power is on their side, where the facts are just fake news, where uncomfortable truths are someone else's problem. Now, Kafka saw this 100 years ago. He wrote about people trapped inside systems they couldn't see. And the kicker is, his characters weren't prisoners. They're volunteers. Joseph K., he keeps going back to court. The villagers keep obeying the castle. Gregor Samsa's family keeps pretending the giant insect in the bedroom is a manageable situation. They participate in their own processing, and they call it normal. That's where we are. Not a country that's been deceived, a country that's co-authoring the deception. Alternative facts aren't imposed from above. They're crowdsourced. Their identity, their community. They're the price of admission to the tribe that still makes you feel like you belong. And cheap faith, that political belief that never has to confront evidence, conviction that costs you nothing because you never test it against reality, cheap faith is the engine. It's comfortable. It's social. It's easy. And it's rotting the foundation of every institution this country depends on to function. The machine can map the patterns. Kafka can name them, but the choice, reality or illusion, the heavy thing or the soft dream, that's human. It's always been human. And right now, there's a lot of humans who are choosing the dream. And, I don't know how you wake up a country that's chosen to sleep, but I know that the first step is naming what's happening, and that's what we did tonight. I'm Analog Scott, and you've been listening to Talking to the Machine, where humans, AI, and the news talk back. Confidence is provisional, and verification is mandatory. The show lives at loopta.com. That's Looptah, loop2ahuman.com. Find us wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube, deeper reads, and extra context on Substack. Links on the site. And if you got a question for the machine or for Joe, Mitchell, Francois, or Norm, hit us up on Instagram at TalkToMachines, all one word. Reality doesn't care whether you carry it or not. It's still there when you put it down. Take care of each other and keep it real.